24 hours ago, Kier Starmer was walking back to Parliament, the parliamentary estate, after a meeting at the Ministry of Defence. He was surrounded by protesters who were of sufficient concern to his security detail that the opposition leader was bundled into a police car for his own safety. You've seen the pictures, I'm sure. Several people, including at least one Tory MP, linked those scenes with the Prime Minister's comments in the Commons last week when he said that Keir Starmer had failed to prosecute the paedophile Jimmy Savile when he was in charge of the Crown Prosecution Service. Among the slurs hurled at Sir Keir last night, yesterday afternoon, were phrases like pedo protector. Well, this afternoon, the Speaker of the House of Commons seemed to have those comments from Boris Johnson in mind when he said that words have consequences. Words have consequences. But was the Speaker right to make a connection between the Prime Minister's much criticised comments about Starmer and Savile and the actions of yesterday's mob? Well, our political correspondent Tom Harwood, who's been assailed by the same, pretty much, group of protesters who tore into Sir Keir yesterday, pointed out today that it's wrong to suggest they've been spurred into action by the PM's words. Even when they surrounded Keir Starmer yesterday, the protesters were sloganeering about Julian Assange, Magna Carta and vaccines, of course, more besides. Tom's here in the studio to reflect on that. Tom, thanks for coming in. I know we were going to talk about levelling up as well. Maybe we'll get round to that in the fullness of time. Let's start with your experience personally. In Parliament Square and the streets off, there is I won't call them rent-a-mob or anything like that. There is a group of committed people, I think probably mainly connected through an anti-vax ideology, you know better than I do, but who pick up on a range of different subjects. I ought to say Sarah Elliott's alongside. People are wondering who we all are. Tell us about what happened to you, Tom.
This was over the summer. There'd been a number of journalists who've had it actually worse than I have. But there's a rabble of people who like to hang around the gates of Downing Street and Parliament Square, sort of making their voices known, talking about vaccines which they believe to be...
And this was you, Tom. We're looking at pictures of... this was you.
For those on the radio, yep, this is me. There's a woman behind me actually shouting some pretty vile things at everyone in the media, everyone who assumes that they're talking to, they think they're part of the establishment or whatever. One of the things that was shouted at me, interestingly, was the words pedo protector.
When was this?
This was back in July. And this is something that regularly this group of people hurl at people who they see as of the media or of the establishment. And it's something that has gone back quite some time. The phrase pedo protector is often levelled at the BBC, and often anyone who turns up outside Parliament with a camera is thought of as in somehow connected to the BBC as well. What I'm trying to say here is that this is a group of people who have form. This wasn't a new incident. It's a terrible incident, and I think we should all extend our heartfelt feelings towards Sir Keir Starmer. No one should have to go through it, but it's something that I've received to a lesser degree. The BBC's Nick Watt has been chased down by these same people. Many of the people you can spot in the video are the very same people who shouted the same slurs at journalists and at politicians. This has happened before, and I think it would be just deeply peculiar to assume that had the Jimmy Savile row not happened last week, that these people would somehow merrily ignore the leader of the opposition as he left Parliament and maybe wave him by and not say a word when they've used these shouts and insults at so many other people. I think that's such a peculiar train of thought, and yet it's one that the media seems to have bought into.
Tom, I'm so glad we're addressing this. I think it's one of those stories that really needs unpacking properly. Sarah Elliott, I mean, admittedly, it was early this morning as I switched on the Today programme on Radio 4, but it felt like they were making a very direct connection between the words of Boris Johnson and then what this, in quotes, mob was saying yesterday. But actually, ... there seemed to be an additional inference. Now, maybe just for those of a fervent imagination were joining up the dots, but it felt like we were maybe rekindling memories of, I don't know, somebody from your home country whose words had inspired kinetic action. OK, maybe I'm going over the top. You know what I'm driving at.
Right. I mean, I think now it's very common to put kind of intention behind words and things. So ever since January 6th, of which I do think the President Trump held some responsibility for it, but now everyone is saying on the left that everyone on the right is trying to incite that type of violence, that type of behavior. And it's just, it's apples and oranges. You can't compare the two. It also ignores what the left does to incite emotion, or possible
We've
intent.
got Andy Ngo coming in later.
Yeah.
For people who maybe have heard of Andy Ngo, best-selling author. I've read his book. He's got 1 million followers on Twitter. But the key point is he's been a victim of Antifa violence in America.
That's right.
And you can talk about what's inspiring them, but the reality is political violence.
And you never
in
hear about that on the mainstream media. You never hear about the radical left or what politicians are saying on the left. Like, there is an African-American congresswoman, Democrat in America, who said to her followers, get into people's faces, get into the restaurants' faces. Don't let Republicans eat at restaurants or do business here. Now, we don't know about that over here on this side of the pond. And guess what? Most of Americans don't know about it either because the mainstream media will not pick that up. So there are Democrats that do it as well.
Tom, can I just go back? I'm being urged to move on to another story, which I think is far less important than this story. So, with all respect to the voices in my ear, I'm going to stick with the story for a little bit longer. We meant to deconstruct the video and actually transcribe some of what was said by those protesters. I mentioned in my introduction, they're talking about the Magna Carta.
Yes.
They're talking about Julian Assange.
Yes.
They're talking predominantly, actually, about vaccines. We didn't have the time or the wherewithal to deconstruct that video, but you've listened to it.
I have, and there are several different videos from different angles, most of which, if people have the time and look up at these videos on Twitter, most of them you can't hear a single word about Jimmy Savile. In one, presumably shot by the person who shouted the comment about Jimmy Savile, it's very audible. Interestingly, that's the one that BBC Newsnight chose to show last night. But in most of the videos, actually, you'd be hard-pressed to hear something about Jimmy Savile, because most of the shouting is outrageous things that shouldn't be shouted at any politician about using the words traitor, using the word, shouting about Julian Assange, shouting about all sorts of things. Magna Carta. There's this movement that believes that no COVID regulations were justified because of Magna Carta, sealed, of course, in 1215 and annulled by the Pope a year later, as if that has any legal force left in this country. But many might wish it did, but I'm afraid these people are deeply misled if they believe that to be true. The point about this group of people and their gathering that was advertised by, among others, Piers Corbyn, the anti-vax leader of that movement, really, in the United Kingdom. This was there was a flyer put out to get people to attend First Downing Street and then Parliament Square yesterday. That flyer made no mention of Jimmy Savile. It made mention of vaccines. It made mention of of bringing down the government and bringing down the opposition. The idea this was to do with Boris Johnson's comments is a stretch.
I know we need to move on, but I just want one final thought, and that is to put the contrary side of the argument, Sarah, which is people yelling at their TV screens, computer screens, and maybe at their radio right now, saying, well, hang on, Joe Cox was killed. There is a connection sometimes between what is said and what then happens.
I mean, yes, but we also are in a country where you can freely express yourself and freely assemble, and this is why it's dangerous to be a politician today, because you don't really know the motives. David Amos, it's very. You're very unsure of what people will do, in these kind of situations.
I'm going to extend this for one last moment. Since you mentioned Sir David Amos, that introduced, Tom, I would suggest to you and others, the seeds of doubt. I'm not a conspiracist, but I think when people saw that lost weekend of debate in Parliament about how the coarsening of political debate somehow produced the violent scenes on the streets of Southend, I was left scratching my head, and I was not alone.
Well, we need to be careful around talking about the specifics of this case. I believe there's an ongoing trial about this, but I'm pretty sure that it's safe to say that it was very little to do with what people said in nasty tweets to one another, which extraordinarily is what the debate became about. I'm sure in very short order we will be able to explore in much more detail the real reasoning behind that. But the idea that politicians on all sides of the House jumped after a coarsening of online debate when it seems like very like other and long-established methods, reasonings and ideologies were behind that brutal killing. That is deeply peculiar and shows our political discussion to be in a very worrying place.
Tom, appreciate your work today. I know we've got a debate about this coming up, and also Nigel Farage coming in at the top of the five to reflect on some of his personal experiences at the hands of those who perhaps take words too far.